In 1939, the world entered a conflict that would reshape the entire 20th century. Unlike modern wars like Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, where public support dwindled as harsh realities set in, the Second World War was largely celebrated during and well after its end. In this video, we'll uncover the reasons behind this. You'll hear about the unyielding enthusiasm on the home front, from British families huddled around radios on D-Day to Red Army soldiers referring to their struggle as a sacred war. We'll also explore what made this war feel uniquely justified for so many: the battle against fascism, genocide, and tyranny. But that's just part of the narrative. This video pushes back against the notion of World War II as a single, cohesive war. Instead, it investigates the premise that two wars occurred simultaneously, one fought by imperialistic governments for dominance, and another, less formal conflict led by ordinary citizens rising against occupation and fascism in the name of freedom and justice. From the atrocities of Treblinka to the revolutionary streets of Barcelona, we'll chart how these parallel conflicts intertwined, contradicted, and influenced the legacy of the most catastrophic war in history. If you believe you know the true essence of World War II, this could change your perspective. The Second World War is distinct from other conflicts of the 20th century. Unlike wars such as the First World War, Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, which started with public backing, only to see that support fade as governments' true motives surfaced, the Second World War didn't follow that pattern. Its reputation stayed positive throughout and continues to resonate today. In nations that endured Axis rule, there was genuine celebration at the defeat of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Interestingly, polls in the United States showed that support for the war actually increased despite rising casualties. President Roosevelt maintained approval ratings above 70%, although interest in peace efforts waned. A similar scenario unfolded in Britain, where mass observation volunteers closely monitored public feelings by eavesdropping and evaluating conversations. Early in the war, many expressed frustration over a perceived inaction, with remarks like, "I can't understand why we aren't doing anything. Why don't we attack Italy or take action in Abyssinia?" Observers noted the enthusiastic reactions whenever military news surfaced. While today's imperialists may not rattle cans for funds, in 1940, the creation of a fighter plane fund stood out, showcasing everyone's collective efforts in contributing. Even after enduring years of relentless hardship and significant losses, the enthusiasm didn't wane. News of the Normandy landings on D-Day in 1944 ignited immense joy, with a child exclaiming, "Daddy, the second front started." The father rushed downstairs, fumbling with the radio, asking if it was true and insisting, "No jokes, you're kidding." The family gathered around breakfast, too excited to eat, bursting with a desire to rush out and check with neighbors about the invasion. Throughout it all, mass observation surveys revealed no signs of war fatigue. Thousands of miles away, Dmitry Loza, a Red Army officer, described the fight against Nazism as a sacred war. He remembered how the war reached them on June 22, 1941, bringing bloodshed, tears, concentration camps, and the destruction of their cities and villages, along with countless deaths. He envisioned that if all the tears shed over those 4 years could be gathered and poured over Germany, that nation would be drowned beneath a vast ocean. Even after 70 years, interest in the Second World War remains strong. As Loza anticipated, 10 or even 100 generations of true patriots will not forget this war. No other conflict has inspired as many historical accounts, novels, or plays. Almost half of all war films focus on the Second World War, while the First World War, Vietnam, and Korea together account for only 16%. The remainder spans from ancient Rome to science fiction. It's remarkable how such a devastating war continues to captivate people. It's essential to recall the words of a Japanese commentator about casualty figures. "We shouldn't reduce deaths to mere numbers. Each represented a life with a name and face. My brother may just be part of millions, but to me, he's my only elder brother. For my mother, he was her sole eldest son. Recognize the dead as individuals." Yet the statistics are staggering. The First World War led to up to 21 million deaths. The Vietnam conflict resulted in 5 million lives lost over 2 decades, and the US-led war in Iraq caused 655,000 casualties within 3 years. Estimates regarding the years from 1939 to 45 suggest that around 50 million people lost their lives, including 28 million civilians. China's losses alone were comparable to those of Germany, Britain, and France collectively during the First World War. So why didn't this devastation tarnish the perception of the Second World War? It's tied to the prevailing belief that it was a good war, where righteousness triumphed over injustice, democracy overcame dictatorship, tolerance beat back racism, and freedom triumphed over fascism. Turkel's oral history of America captures this feeling by noting that it was perceived as different from previous conflicts. Most people felt it wasn't imperialistic. Our enemy was unmistakably evil. They were responsible for the Holocaust. Many who opposed other wars supported this one with passion. It was seen as a just war, if such a concept holds true. On the Eastern Front, Loza confirmed this sentiment, highlighting that people united against their oppressors, aggressors, thieves, and torturers, the very essence of fascism. They channeled all their outrage into resisting this abhorred enemy. Millions of individuals felt compelled to fight against fascist genocide and tyranny, steadfastly believing in their cause. Their intense hatred for Hitler and his allies was completely justified. Frank Capra's famous propaganda film, Why We Fight, outlined that the Axis powers were pursuing world domination. This assertion rang true, whether through Germany's quest for Lebensraum, Italy's dream of a new Roman Empire, or Japan's misleadingly named Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. A few examples illustrate the catastrophic consequences a victory for the Axis would have had for humanity. The Nazis built their ideology on racism, leading to appalling realities such as Jewish women arriving at Treblinka, having their hair cut off to be sent to Germany for mattress production before they were gassed, often at rates of 10,000 to 12,000 daily. They aimed to execute these individuals within 10 minutes of their arrival. Tragically, infants with their mothers were viewed as a troublesome hindrance during the shaving process, leading to the separation of babies from their mothers immediately upon disembarking the train. Those children were herded into a large ditch, and once a sufficient number were gathered, they were shot and disposed of in the fire. If mothers succeeded in keeping their babies with them, a German guard would grab the baby by the legs and smash it against the barracks wall until it was nothing more than a bloody mass in his hands. While Italian fascism may not have been as overtly racist, the invasion of Abyssinia in 35 to 36 involved horrific tactics, including the use of gas. Mussolini's son, a pilot, referred to this act of conquest as magnificent sport, claiming, "One group of horsemen looked like a budding rose blooming amidst the bombs that fell among them and blew them up. It was extremely enjoyable." Japan's attack on China led to the notorious Rape of Nanjing in 37. Over 2 months, the army committed unspeakable acts, violating at least 20,000 women, most of whom were subsequently killed, and taking the lives of 200,000 men. Even though Allied forces eventually stopped these specific atrocities, it complicates the idea of seeing the Second World War simply as a good war. The Axis powers were not the only ones guilty of brutality. The United States bombing of Hiroshima is just one example. Furthermore, it's naive to believe that the leaders of the Allied forces had the same motives as ordinary citizens. Despite their public speeches, it's unreasonable to think that the governments of Britain, France, Russia, or the United States genuinely opposed the concept of world conquest. Consider the Atlantic Charter, praised by the Times for rallying the good forces of the world, freedom and restoration for the oppressed nations. In August 41, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill promised to uphold the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. Stalin, too, was quick to vow Russia's complete support of the Atlantic Charter's principles. However, when Churchill presented the Charter in the House of Commons, he made it clear that it did not change any policies concerning the British Empire. It only applied to the states and nations of Europe now under the Nazi yoke. This narrow interpretation was overlooked when it came to actual execution. In October 44, British and Russian leaders met to make decisions that Churchill later described as so crude and even callous that they couldn't serve as the basis for any official document. Ultimately, Churchill's pride took over, and he recorded the percentages agreement. In that moment, he suggested a division. How about you take 90% in Romania, we take 90% in Greece, and we split Yugoslavia 50-50. As it was translated, he penned down, Romania, Russia 90%, others 10%. Greece, Great Britain 90%, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia 50-50%, Hungary 50-50%. Bulgaria, Russia 75%, others 25%. He passed the note to Stalin, who had heard the translation. After a short pause, Stalin marked it with a big tick and returned it. It was all settled quickly. I noted, could it seem a bit cynical if we appeared to handle these matters, so vital to millions, so casually? Let's get rid of the document. No, you should keep it, Stalin replied. Even though the USA wasn't directly part of the discussions in Moscow, it shared a similarly cynical view on peace. One prominent figure remarked, at this rate, the peace we are creating will be fueled by oil and shipping, lacking any moral intent. Perhaps it lacked moral intent, but Hull, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of State, emphasized that the USA would lead a new system of international relations solely for national self-interest. This book argues that the gap between the intentions of Allied governments and those fighting against brutality and repression was unbridgeable. Thus, the significant events from 1939 to 1945 did not symbolize a united fight against the Axis powers, but represented two distinct wars. While unconventional, this perspective resonates with Clausewitz's famous statement that war is not just a political act, it is also a crucial political tool, a continuation of political engagement carried out through different means. This can be seen in a policy that opts for combat instead of mere diplomatic messages. None of the essential strategies for war can be crafted without understanding political relationships. During the Second World War, the political interplay between nations led to conflict between the Axis and Allied powers. However, the political relations between people and their governments sparked another war, fought by individuals for their own aims, especially evident in the resistance movements that operated beyond formal governmental control. The idea of two wars reshapes our understanding of the Second World War. Allied leaders portrayed a united front among their nations and citizens. For example, when Britain's Prime Minister embraced Russia as an ally, he claimed that all past conflicts were forgotten. The Nazi regime stands alongside the worst elements of communism, yet the history of its crimes and tragedies is behind us. We share one mission and an unwavering goal. We are dedicated to eradicating Hitler and every vestige of the Nazi regime. This is not a class struggle. It is a fight where the entire British Empire and Commonwealth unite, irrespective of race, belief, or political stance. It symbolizes the fight for freedom everywhere around the world. Despite their ideological differences, Stalin agreed that their only aim was to dismantle Hitler's regime and bore no resentment towards the Prime Minister's statements. Both leaders were resolute in their battle against the Axis powers, not just to liberate people globally, but also to preserve Allied influence over their territories. Alternatively, some view the Second World War as fundamentally imperialist. Trotsky, an unwavering opponent of fascism, recognized the legitimate anger workers had towards it. He pointed out that Hitler's victories and horrific acts understandably stirred deep resentment among workers worldwide. However, he argued that the Allies weren't fighting to end fascism, they aimed to keep their control intact. Therefore, the triumph of the imperialists in Great Britain and France would be just as fatal for humanity as the victories of Hitler and Mussolini. History urges us to oppose one imperial faction against another, and instead, strive to dismantle the whole system. Trotsky's resistance to the Second World War wasn't rooted in pacifism. He supported just wars that promote the liberation of oppressed people and encourage human advancement. He also did not dismiss democracy. Bolsheviks aimed to uphold a form of democracy, but not one led by unaccountable elites. Trotsky argued that while the Second World War was an imperialist struggle, it should be confronted in favor of a people's fight against fascism. First, we must free our democracy from capitalist magnates. Then we will defend it with all our might. Trotsky was killed by Stalin's agent in 1940, missing the chance to see the simultaneous unfolding of the two processes he described. Howard Zinn and Henry Michel offer a different perspective, acknowledging that both anti-fascist and imperialist elements were at play during the Second World War, and categorizing these into short-term and long-term factors. We can endlessly debate if there were short-term alternatives, or if fascism could have been resisted without the loss of 50 million lives. Nevertheless, the long-term effects of World War II on global thought were deeply damaging. It revived the idea of war, which had been thoroughly condemned after the pointless devastation of World War I. It provided political leaders, regardless of the destructive paths they chose or the chaos they caused, like the 2 million dead in Korea, and at least as many in Southeast Asia, along with hundreds of thousands in Iraq, with a reference point in World War II as a model. Michel's analysis in Shadow War is significant because it explores the resistance while recognizing the complexities of the Second World War, all while asserting its fundamental unity. During this conflict, two types of warfare occurred. One involved the massive, conventional armies of both sides clashing head-on. The other was fought in secrecy, underground. On the Allied side, these two elements, though part of a unified whole, could not have been more different. Yet, none of these interpretations fully capture the conflicting nature of the situation. The notion of a single coherence, whether it's patriotic unity, blatant imperialism, a blend of immediate and long-range influences, or a mix of official and clandestine warfare, breaks down upon deeper examination. Beyond unity against the Axis, there was a volatile mixture of forces that could coalesce into distinct opposing factions under certain conditions. Governments and farmers, military headquarters and barracks, boardrooms and laborers, each was embroiled in a different struggle, one fueled by imperialism, the other a people's fight. These terms cover a range of contexts and necessitate clarity and historical understanding. Imperialism encompassed both the governmental strategy of foreign control and the internal systems that supported and perpetuated this approach. Importantly, before World War II, both the Allied and Axis powers were driven by imperialist goals, though they weren't exact reflections of one another. Just like a chess player finds themselves in a different position after several moves against their opponent, let's take a moment to look at the Allies. In 1939, Britain boasted the largest empire ever, commanding a quarter of the world's population and land, an empire where the sun never sets, but the blood never dries. France had the second largest overseas empire, covering 10% of the Earth's surface. The USSR represented 1/6 of the world, though most of its citizens weren't Russian. Under Stalin, it became a prison house of the peoples, expanding later to much of Eastern Europe. While the height of U.S. imperialism was yet to come, in 1939, the U.S. was concentrating on establishing its economic might, laying the groundwork for a military that would eventually include 737 bases around the globe and over 2.5 million personnel. In contrast to Britain, France, and Russia, the Axis powers were late to the imperial game. Japan emerged from isolation in 1867, Italy unified in 1870, and Germany soon followed. By that time, the world was already partitioned, and these nations felt compelled to claim their place through forcefully displacing established competitors. Germany made this attempt during the First World War but faced consequences from the Treaty of Versailles. Italy and Japan, despite backing the Entente in that conflict, were left disillusioned when they didn't receive the expected spoils. As the Second World War unfolded, all three nations would once again seek imperial dominance. Conversely, the Allies' imperialistic strategies were less cruel. Britain and France relied on their citizens' sense of democracy, portraying their actions as protective measures for past acquisitions. Meanwhile, the governments of the United States and Russia framed their participation as a reaction to outside threats. The same could not be said for the Axis powers. Leaders in Germany, Italy, and Japan understood that to reclaim global dominance, they would need to adopt an even more extreme right-wing authoritarian stance to unite their populations. This urgency was heightened by their absence of an empire. which meant they couldn't shift the weight of post-war economic struggles onto colonial subjects. As a result, they encountered immense pressures and significant class struggles, heightened by the international communist movement that emerged after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Consequently, all the Axis powers adopted some form of fascist or militaristic rule. In Germany and Italy, those in power had to share authority with populist leaders like Hitler and Mussolini. In Japan, the military held the reins of power. These regimes realized that taking and maintaining control over territory from established imperial powers left no space for humanitarian pretenses, either domestically or internationally. Life under the Axis would be severe. Conversely, Britain, France, and Russia gradually expanded their empires, allowing them to embrace more complex ideologies, whether religious, racial, or political, to rationalize their actions. Stripped of all the rhetoric, the Second World War can be seen not as a true struggle against global domination, but as a conflict between the Allied and Axis governments over who would govern. The widespread belief among ordinary people that this was about fighting fascism was largely insignificant to the leaders on either side. The events before, during, and after the war support this perspective. The Axis powers had clear goals and tactics, but their opponents were not a noble force dedicated to saving the world from fascism. Instead, they formed an unlikely coalition that didn't come together until nearly 2 years into the fight. The idea that the Allies were genuine partners was an illusion. Before the war, the United States maintained an isolationist approach, sticking to Coolidge's belief that the business of America is business. President Roosevelt showed little interest in global issues until it became apparent what an Axis victory could entail. Nazi control in Europe would not be confined to that area alone. Additionally, Britain, having nearly exhausted its resources from World War I, depended on United States support to survive the Second World War, thus losing its position as a world power. In Asia, Japan was competing directly with the United States for influence. Zinn highlights a State Department memo that cautioned that Japanese expansion would greatly undermine America's diplomatic and strategic standing, leading to insurmountable restrictions on access to crucial resources like rubber, tin, and jute in Asia and the Pacific. Roosevelt decided to impose an oil embargo on Japan, which left the country with a stark choice: back off from its imperial ambitions or retaliate. The events at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 changed the game. Prior to 1939, Britain saw communism as a greater threat to its authority than Nazism. Because of this, it ignored Stalin's calls for an anti-Nazi alliance and chose to appease Germany instead. Britain stood by as Hitler flouted the military restrictions of the Versailles Treaty starting in 1935, first approving the expansion of the German Navy, then tolerating a massive increase in the Wehrmacht and the establishment of the banned Luftwaffe, only raising concerns when Austria was annexed. In 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pressured Czechoslovakia into ceding territory to Germany, proclaiming peace in our time with Hitler. It wasn't until Poland was invaded, revealing Hitler's unquenchable ambitions, that Britain felt it had no choice but to enter the conflict. A practical alliance with Russia formed when Hitler invaded the USSR, bringing the two nations together against a shared enemy. By that point, Stalin had come to the conclusion that Britain and France were too focused on appeasement to assist him in resisting the German expansion that threatened Russia. As a result, he forged a notorious pact with Hitler and expressed at the 18th Communist Party Congress his intention to let both sides in any future war exhaust themselves before he intervened with renewed force. The shared trials of World War II did not erase the tensions among the Allies. This uneasy partnership of former foes lasted only throughout the fighting. After 1945, Britain, unable to sustain its vast empire, begrudgingly accepted a subordinate role alongside the USA. The USA had emerged as a superpower with nuclear capabilities, ready to dictate the terms at the war's end, as hinted by President Harry Truman. Once an ally, Russia was now branded the evil empire, plunging a generation into fears of nuclear annihilation and the grim realities of the Cold War. This spurred Moscow to quickly develop its own nuclear arsenal, both for defense and as a menacing reminder to its former partners. The notion of imperialism wasn't limited to the main powers. Many nations without empires acted as satellites to those in control. Governments in exile operated from cities like London and Cairo. Imperialism functioned as a societal system where capitalism was deeply intertwined with government policies. Consider occupied France as a clear example of how national and international policies merged during the Second World War. From his base in London, de Gaulle called for restoring his country's imperial stature by ousting the Nazis, while the Vichy regime opted for collaboration with German imperialism to maintain control over the working class. Each side presented a different facet of imperialism. The imperialist conflict employed its own brutal tactics, starkly contrasting with the approaches of resistance movements. The idea of a people's war is more nuanced and can come across as unclear. Looking at how Stalin labeled the Eastern European nations he governed as people's democracies highlights how the term people can be distorted. To clarify the concept of people's war, we need to ask important questions. First, who exactly are the people? This war didn't mean everyone was involved. During occupation, the difficulty of connecting with a covert movement, along with the threat of Gestapo arrests, meant only a minority participated actively. Yet organized resistors earned admiration from broader communities for their courage and sacrifices. In unoccupied Allied nations, many individuals stepped up to fight for freedom and a better future, even when following leaders with differing opinions. In Asia, people stood against colonialism from both European and Japanese oppressors. The key point is that regardless of the extent to which the people were involved, the war was fought for them. Another question to explore is, how does people's war differ from class or national war? The Marxist interpretation of class, which defines a social group by its relation to production, doesn't quite fit the narrative of people's war, even in cases like Italy, where workers were active. Resistors came from various backgrounds. Nevertheless, people's war cannot be simply equated with national war. It aimed for more than just independence. It sought to go beyond merely maintaining or restoring the current state in society. Class conflict and national conflict cannot exist in isolation. People's war combined both aspects. From a class perspective, its ideology rejected the social structure that existed before the war and advocated for the lower classes, regardless of their backgrounds. On a national level, the warriors of the people asserted that the true nation was embodied by the masses, not the discredited elites. The hesitation of the Allied ruling classes to challenge foreign oppressors, along with their readiness to appease the Axis before and during the occupation, reinforced this idea. While it might be convenient to separate class struggle from national struggle, that simply wasn't realistic for the reasons stated. Likewise, it would be advantageous to distinguish liberation movements from imperial influences, yet they were often intertwined in ways that made this impossible. Although the concept of parallel wars has been explored in several insightful national studies, such as Angus Calder's The People's War on Britain, this kind of analysis hasn't consistently been applied to the entirety of the Second World War. On the traditional battlefield, commanders and soldiers acted in unison, despite their differing opinions, making it challenging to distinguish between the two conflicts even for those involved. Nevertheless, there were instances when the division was sharply evident. In countries under Axis control, independent mass resistance movements arose, much to the frustration of Allied powers. In Asia, colonial authority was weakened due to the European War or was dismantled by Japanese invasion. A revealing moment occurred in 1945 when Allied governments pursued a peace settlement that reflected their victory in the imperialist war, which meant reinstating the pre-war order. In contrast, local populations dreamed of a post-war world shaped by the success of their people's war. Creating a complete history here is beyond the scope of this brief work. Unlike works that focus on battles, technology, generals, and armies, or those centered on individual leaders or nations, this narrative highlights the places where the two conflicts are most vividly illustrated. Naturally, many countries are left out, with Russia being the most significant absence. It played a crucial role in defeating Hitler, but did not experience parallel wars for two key reasons. The harsh methods employed by the Nazi invaders rallied the populace around the Stalinist regime, which was fiercely fighting for its survival. Unlike resistance efforts elsewhere, the numerous Soviet partisans bravely combating behind German lines never presented a real alternative to Moscow. Additionally, the Russian state was incredibly repressive. Entire ethnic groups viewed as potential threats, such as the Chechens, were uprooted and forced eastward under brutal conditions. This left little room for a true people's war to emerge. The only notable opposition to Moscow came from rogue soldiers aligning with General Vlasov's forces, but they were merely instruments of Nazi imperialism. The lack of a genuine people's war would have dire consequences for those who came under the Red Army's control as it drove the Nazis out of Eastern Europe. While this book does not delve deeply into Russia, it's crucial to acknowledge the country's significant impact on the related conflicts. Foreign communist parties played pivotal roles in nearly all resistance efforts, leading, inspiring, and sacrificing themselves in the name of the People's War. However, their allegiance to Stalin's Russia led them to bend to its imperial ambitions, resulting in their acceptance of abrupt policy changes. Until the mid-1930s, the USSR endorsed a third period line, claiming that open-class struggle was the only urgent matter, and viewing all other parties, whether fascist or leftist reformist, as mere tools of capitalism to be confronted equally. This limited view contributed to Hitler's ascent, paving the way for the Popular Front policy. Class divisions faded away, calling on everyone who wasn't openly fascist, including right-wing imperial supporters in Britain, France, and beyond, to unite in defense of national interests and the Soviet Union. Even with a brief pause due to the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939, Popular Frontism continued throughout World War II. It led to extraordinary circumstances, with communists, more than any other group, organizing and championing widespread opposition to fascism, giving hope to workers and peasants for a brighter future post-war. At the same time, they limited struggles to avoid alarming the imperialist nations allied with Russia. Thus, they both ignited and restrained mass movements, helping to vanquish fascism while allowing discredited ruling elites to regain power at the expense of ordinary people. The interplay between communists, the people's struggle, and the policies of an imperialist nation shows that the supporters of imperialism didn't neatly fit into one camp, nor did the advocates for the people's fight belong solely to another. These groups interacted and coexisted within movements, organizations, and among individuals. Therefore, we must avoid simplifying the concept of parallel wars. One notable nation often left out of this discussion is China. Its complex conflict involving Japanese forces, nationalist Chinese, and Communist Party armies echoes some of the themes we've explored here. However, the critical events that led to Mao's People's Liberation Army triumph in 1948 fall outside this investigation. Despite these omissions, the varied examples highlighted should bolster the idea of viewing parallel wars as a legitimate lens through which to understand the Second World War. If the Second World War was truly a fight for democracy against fascism, it didn't start in 1939 in Poland, but rather in Spain 3 years earlier, when the people began resisting General Franco's nationalist uprising. Franco himself acknowledged this in 1941 when he informed Hitler that the first battle of the Second World War was won in Spain. An American volunteer fighting against fascism expressed a different viewpoint. To me, World War II started on July 18, 1936. That's when the first shot was fired in Madrid. This perspective is seldom recognized as the starting point, mainly because Allied governments had yet to engage in the conflict. As a result, Americans who returned from the Civil War were branded premature anti-fascists and called before what became McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee, accused of opposing a coup that, according to the nationalist publication El Correo Español, sought to liberate Europe from the filth of democracy. Although Franco was more of a military figure than a classic fascist like Mussolini or Hitler, his links to fascism and Nazism were clear from the start. Without Hitler's Junkers 52 aircraft to transport troops from Morocco, the rebellion could have faltered. Mussolini quickly stepped in with aircraft, arms, and ships, Throughout the conflict, the nationalists heavily relied on Axis powers, receiving support and weaponry along with reinforcements from 16,000 German troops and 80,000 Italian soldiers. Franco claimed his movement wasn't just fascist, yet he recognized that fascism significantly influenced the new state. The nationalists adapted the Nazi slogan to declare, "One fatherland, one state, one caudillo." As a result, Francoist ideology has been described as a mix of fascist corporatism and religious obscurantism. The nationalists used tactics that anticipated the harsh policies enacted by the Axis in other areas. A phalangist acknowledged that the repression in nationalist territory was executed with chilling calculation and precision. In Malaga, a city that surrendered without a fight, 4,000 individuals were executed in just 1 week. This extreme violence drew criticism even from the Italians and Germans, who deemed such indiscriminate repression short-sighted, suggesting that the nationalists should recruit workers into a fascist party instead of eliminating them. The lower number of executions in the nationalist zone in 1937 was also attributed to the dwindling targets available. When the conflict concluded on April 1, 1939, the death toll reached 300,000. While Spain didn't join the Axis and officially upheld neutrality, this was merely a reflection of the nation's fatigue and Hitler's reluctance to meet Franco's requests for entry. Nonetheless, Franco sent the Blue Division, comprised of 47,000 men, to fight alongside the Wehrmacht in Russia. The Spanish Civil War did not follow a typical army versus army dynamic, but represented a struggle between army and revolution. An anarchist who spent 2 decades in Franco's prisons recounted how the People's War began in Barcelona, aimed not only at defeating the nationalists, but also opposing the elected Republican government that Franco intended to dismantle. The generals' coup had been anticipated for months. Everyone recognized their goal was to overthrow their employers in the Republic and set up their dictatorship modeled on fascist nations. Many believed the government was trapped, and arming the people was the only answer. In contrast, the Popular Front government urged the army to remain loyal. When the army eventually revolted, the reaction was swift and decisive. Within 24 hours, Barcelona was in their hands. This was a war of the people, uniting resistance against Franco on the battlefields while also igniting a class struggle behind them. Militia groups headed out to face the rebel forces, and upon their return, they confronted their employers. In Barcelona, an impressive 80% of businesses were collectivized, driven by a decree that proclaimed, "The victory of the people will mean the death of capitalism." By December 1936, George Orwell observed the transformation. The working class was stepping into their power. Every shop and cafe bore signs of their collectivization. Even the bootblacks had their boxes painted in revolutionary red and black. Waiters and shop assistants interacted with customers as equals, and the formalities of speech vanished for a time. Tipping was even outlawed. A significant change during the Civil War was the evolving role of women. One woman noted, "Women were no longer objects. They were recognized as individuals, equal to men." This was one of the most significant social advances of the era. The conflict that began in 1936 was, in many ways, a precursor to a world war. Alongside the Spanish working class standing up against Franco were the international brigades, with around 32,000 volunteers from 53 nations. The largest group came from neighboring France, with many anti-fascist exiles from Italy and Germany joining the fight. This formation emerged in response to a call from the Communist International. Support for the Spanish struggle united liberals, socialists, and Democrats, although 85% of the brigadiers were aligned with political parties. In Britain, for example, the Labour Party initially pledged to provide all practicable support to defend freedom and democracy in Spain, while public opinion showed a striking 8-to-1 preference for the Republican Popular Front government over Franco. Yet, the future allies of World War II chose not to support this anti-fascist struggle. Rather than backing the democratically elected government, the French and British advocated for a non-intervention committee, claimed to be supported by all European nations, which aimed to prevent both sides in Spain from receiving arms and fighters. Neville Chamberlain declared, We have no wish or intention to interfere with the internal affairs of any other nation. This so-called neutrality actually benefited Franco since the Republic had lost its key weapons to the rebels and couldn't procure arms from the international market, even though it was the legitimate government. Additionally, when Italy and Germany blatantly violated the rules, no measures were taken to prevent them from supporting Franco. The British leadership had already concluded that civilization itself was at stake in Spain due to the escalating revolution. In 1936, France elected a Popular Front government led by Blum, who initially wanted to aid the Spanish Republic. However, he feared provoking right-wing factions domestically and felt he needed Britain as an ally against Hitler. Realizing the strong pro-rebel sentiment in the British cabinet, Blum initiated the non-intervention process. The United States could have supplied arms to the Republic, since its neutrality law didn't apply to civil wars, but Washington insisted it would, of course, scrupulously refrain from any interference whatsoever in the unfortunate Spanish situation. Roosevelt referred to events in Spain as a contagion, similar to an epidemic causing a community to isolate itself. Some believe he later regretted a policy that favored Franco and considered sending covert military supplies, though no concrete action was taken to support the Republic. For the first time in American history, travel restrictions were enforced, marking U.S. passports with "not valid for travel in Spain." While the U.S. government obstructed aid to the Republic, large businesses provided Franco with 3 million tons of fuel and thousands of trucks crucial for his war effort. The Spanish Civil War hinted at Russia's future approach to people's wars. The Communist International Brigaders volunteered, driven by their commitment to socialist internationalism, yet Stalin's motives were rooted in the needs of Russian state capitalism. He aimed to check Hitler's ambitions through an alliance with Britain and France, despite risking war on two fronts. A victory for the Spanish Republicans that resulted in the death of capitalism would create a rift with these Western powers, while a Franco victory backed by the Nazis would be equally detrimental. Hugh Thomas highlights that Stalin made a decisive choice regarding Spain. He would not permit the Republic to be defeated, despite not offering the necessary support for it to win. Outside of Mexico, the USSR stood as the Republic's key military ally. However, to effectively counter the nationalists' fascist supplies, Stalin would have needed to send significantly more troops and tanks than he actually did. Nevertheless, any support was appreciated, which heightened Russia's influence and permitted them to orchestrate the removal of the beleaguered leader, Largo Caballero, replacing him with the more pro-Moscow Juan Negrin. Russia pushed for a form of parliamentary democracy that would be acceptable to Britain and France while resisting the revolution that fueled the mass opposition against Franco. This situation highlighted the tension between imperialist warfare and popular warfare, as the demands of Stalin's foreign policy clashed with the People's Revolution. Herbert Matthews from the New York Times had good reasons to claim that the communists were not simply obeying orders. They fought against fascism and, at that moment, for the democracy we recognize today. Yet, their allegiance to what they saw as the world's lone socialist state created a paradox. They embraced Stalinism while advocating for traditional capitalist democracy, all while they fought and sacrificed for a people's war that went beyond it. This contradiction was well expressed by a Scottish communist brigadier who reflected on his deep respect for the Soviet Union. When he finally received a reliable rifle, decorated with a hammer and sickle, to fight the fascists instead of risking his own life, it brought him immense pride. Here was the Workers' Republic stepping in to assist the Spanish in their struggle to uphold democracy within their borders. It's essential to recognize that the fight in Spain was not aimed at creating communism. The interaction of these two wars had a practical military aspect within the Republican effort. Preston points out that after the early defeats of the enthusiastic yet poorly trained and disorganized workers' militias, many moderate Republicans, socialists, communists, and even some anarchists advocated for establishing conventional military forces. However, the main concern remained political. Should the war be conducted in a way that wouldn't alienate Western powers sympathetic to Franco, Or should it focus on dismantling the corrupt systems that had enabled so many Francos over the years? These conflicting perspectives collided in Barcelona during May of 1937. Communists, alongside socialists and bourgeois republicans, crushed the anarchist CNT and the POUM, a group loosely tied to Trotskyism. Hundreds lost their lives, while the NKVD, Russia's secret police, pursued the survivors, quashing the revolutionary aspirations that had sparked during the early Civil War. The Republic's chances for victory were minimal, hampered by isolation, Russia's strategic maneuvers, the indifference of Western allies, and the support for the opposition from the Axis. The crushing of the revolution dampened public enthusiasm and proved ineffective against the nationalists, who triumphed in 1939. Although Britain and France declared war on fascism that same year, their attitude towards the fascist-backed Spanish government did not change. As Glyn Stone points out, the Allied nations entered the war in September 1939 more to counter Nazi ambitions in Europe than to create a new democratic order. Therefore, as long as Spain remained neutral, Franco's regime faced little threat. In 1940, Churchill commended the nationalists, stating that British interests depended on a united and independent Spain, looking forward to her playing a key role in the Mediterranean and Europe. Franco welcomed this support by vigorously siding with Hitler's fight against Russian communism, that dreadful nightmare of our age, dispatching the Blue Division to assist. He cautioned the USA that entering the war would be criminal madness and claimed the Allies had failed. Nevertheless, the British and French governments remained resolute, signing trade deals and continuing to back the weakest fascist regimes, convinced that any upheaval would result in greater chaos and danger. The Civil War left Spain heavily dependent on food imports, and as Indians faced starvation, the Western Allies rushed to meet Spain's needs with large shipments of wheat, along with significant amounts of industrial goods and oil. One American observer remarked that Spanish civilians had the highest petrol consumption in Europe. Allied strategies might have seemed tactically sound, as Spain's official neutrality kept Gibraltar under British control, securing access to the Mediterranean. After 1945, that justification began to waver, as Britain's ambassador noted. With other totalitarian regimes in Europe collapsing, Spain became an exception. When Russia called for Franco's removal and US and British advisors suggested using Allied oil dependence to limit his tyranny, Churchill reacted passionately. "What you're suggesting is akin to sparking a revolution in Spain. You start with oil and it will soon turn to blood. If we interfere in Spain, the communists will seize power, and we can expect that spread to Italy and France." Allowing Franco to stay in power meant the relentless judicial execution of Republicans continued. By 1945, there were about 60 executions each week, with 23 occurring in Madrid in just one day. One could argue against viewing the Second World War as a people's war by pointing out that propaganda often frames all modern imperial conflicts as progressive and democratic. The Spanish experience shows that the push for a people's war during the Second World War had its own origins and grew despite the resistance from Allied governments.